Okay, you can start
Okay, so
whenever.
okay. So the motion analysis that I'll be doing is this House would increase protection and preservation of public lands. So this motion is going to be asking whether government should do more to protect and preserve the land that belongs to everyone, land that's managed for by the state for public benefit, like national parks, wetlands, coastal reserves, city green spaces, all fall under this category. And so it's the real debate is about whether how far government should go in protecting them and what are the trade-offs and whether we should make those trade-offs. So Oh, okay. So this presentation will cover what lands are, why they're important, and why we're having this debate, the proposition and opposition strategy and arguments, some clashes and weighing, and then paths to ballot ideas for both sides. Okay. So public lands are land or water areas held in common for public benefit and managed by a government or public entity. And are legally held in trust for the public. This includes terrestrial parks, marine protected areas, wetlands, urban parks, community forests, and indigenous reserves managed under public law. So they're usually used for ecological purposes, economic purposes, and indigenous purposes. So some of the national parks like Yellowstone, marine protected areas like the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park in Australia. Like for example, the Amazon rainforest really helps ecologically with storing 10% of the world's carbon, and it's home to 3 million species. And then the mangroves are used economically to help the fishing economy because it protects the coastal communities from storms. And then the Serengeti National Park is where the indigenous people's ancestral grazing grounds. So these are some of the examples as to what these public lands are used for and the reasons that they are protected. So the reason these public lands are important is because they have a lot of different reasons as to why they're being protected in the first place. So I think this is really the heart of what the proposition's case is going to be. So the first thing is that climate regulation, a lot of the forests and like the forests store a lot of carbon. In the like for example, the Amazon rainforest, they're also really important for biodiversity. I think like protected areas can have like a disproportionate share of like threatened species. So whenever we protect these lands, there's also going to be species that we're going to be protecting. And then there's going to be ecosystem services, water purification, coastal protection. And then there's also going to be about like the economic livelihoods, for example, the ecotourism in Costa Rica, and also for the cultural and legal rights. For example, the Serengeti National Park is a sacred indigenous sites. So these are all the very important reasons as to why these lands are used. Okay, so this debate largely is about how far government should go to protect public lands. So to increase protection means to first limit activities that harm these environments, like deforestation, mining, overfishing, drilling, or mass tourism. And this protection would essentially be implemented by means of laws, enforcement system, designated conservation zones, while preservation would be maintaining the current cultural identity and ecological balance that it has. And the protected lands would stabilize climate, store carbon, purify air and water, as we see is happening with the current lands. But the problems with this are is that whenever governments create protected zones, there's a lot of indigenous groups, local farmers, and communities that are no longer able to live off the land, which pushes these people into poverty and leads to displacement. So the most strategic framing for the proposition is going to be firstly, is that they should be framing this debate through long-term global survival and cultural preservation. Because whenever you protect the environment, it's not something that's going to happen in a day. It's going to take a long time for the protection of the land to kind of outcut, like to manifest and like fruitful results and like making sure that the environment is protected. There's an ecological balance and the environment is being protected. So essentially, whenever we act now or put this as priority, we firstly act with the intention of having the long term in mind, and secondly, act before ecosystems pass the no point of return, which is essentially like the year in which climate change will become irreversible. The second thing on framing that's important to include is that it needs to include sustainable development um, to ensure that the land will exist for future generations. So even if the opposition is like, hey, some protections are going to fail or not going to work, just because of how the nature of these protections would be implemented, as I'll get into later, even if they even if they fail, we think like doing nothing is probably like the worst thing you could do. Like even if there's a chance at it working, or even if some percentage of it works, we have a better world than the opposition. And then the third thing is what our model is going to be. So there's going to be stricter environmental laws, conservation zones, anti-poaching enforcement. You have to also make sure to assert that because we're increasing the protection and preservation, it's not just the status quo and what's going for what the proposition world looks like. We think we would be increasing it. So even if some laws are not doing what's being needed in the status quo, we think the increased protection and preservation would mean we have the fiat to be able to assume that these laws will be able to protect. Um, and then also the opposition's claims are going to be about more about the local communities. So then we have to talk about like the sustainable development in order to so we co-opt a little bit of what the opposition is going to say. So for the arguments, there's three large arguments that I think is what the proposition should essentially run. So the first is environmental protection. I think this is pretty intuitive, preventing deforestation, coral bleaching, wildlife extinction. Like we looked at like the Amazon protected zones, the Great Barrier Reef Marine Park. This is a very judge-friendly argument to run because it has a global impact. Everyone knows that the environment is super important because we cannot exist without it. It's easy to quantify, it's easy to humanize, and it's very, very intuitive, especially whenever you talk about the point of no return and how there's a sense of immediacy and associated with this. And then I think it can also be weighed through scope and magnitude because it's going to harm everyone. And some people are going to feel the harms a bit more, like coastal communities or rural communities. And then also irreversibility, because whenever you have the environment being destructed without these protections, you will not be able to reverse that. And then also, it's a prerequisite to being able to have any of the economic benefits, being able to have local communities being able to live. And then, if the opposition really doesn't respond to this weighing, the proposition has a really big advantage and probably one of the probably the strongest path to ballot for the proposition. So the second argument that the proposition can run is on the cultural and indigenous rights. So we have like Canada's indigenous land, we have the Serengeti National Park. All these are very sacred lands to those people. And so whenever this is like a very moral, more principled argument that we have an ethical responsibility to preserve these lands and ensure that they like have the importance to the local communities, and making sure that we have like this ethical responsibility and frame it that way gives the proposition offense on the moral ground. And then the third argument for the proposition is on the long-term socioeconomic benefits. So obviously, this is going to be co-opting a little bit of what the opposition is going to give you because they're obviously going to be talking about like the local communities, how they're going to have their economies developed. But this gives the proposition a little bit of unique offense on like how if you preserve them, you're able to have sustainable tourism still, you're able to have climate mitigation, you're able to have ecosystem services. Like for example, like Costa Rica's ecotourism, sorry, supports like local livelihoods and it's maintained sustainably. So this is kind of something that the opposition that gives you unique offense on what the opposition's biggest push is going to be. So the opposition framing is also very important. So firstly, we have to define what protection really looks like. First, we think that it's going to be an overreach that can harm local populations. Remember that the governments are very out of touch with what the local needs of citizens are. And secondly, that a lot of the governments are going to be the main actor that's going to be implementing this. And if they're going to be the ones implementing this, they have to be in touch. They need to not have any like bureaucratic red tape in doing so. Like if this is so immediate, why is like they have to also the proposition must prove that it's going to happen within a very like immediate time frame, but with the nature of a lot of governments, that might not be the case. And so far as like whenever we look at society today, a lot of people don't even believe that climate change is real. So using this type of rhetoric will help get get the proposition looking like, oh, they're very unrealistic and idealistic. So the second thing to characterize on framework is that the proposition is characterizing them as, oh, we need to protect nature, but we also need to make sure that the reason that we're protecting nature is so we can live sustainably in it. So if you're not going to be able to have sustainable development and you're going to develop humans in like cities and then like have these parks and public parks that are going to be very, very protected and not going to be encountered with humans, and there's really no point to these public parks existing, right? Because it should be how can we integrate humans and nature sustainably? And then thirdly, we need to talk about the practicality of the proposition, which is what I'll get into in our offense. And then the fourth is we're going to have sustainability on the opposition, but we think there would be more efforts from the community that lives in these public lands because we think, firstly, they're the most in touch with what the needs of the lands are, and secondly, um, they probably have the most like desire or like incentive to be able to make sure that these lands are accurately protected. So the first argument on the opposition is going to be on like economic development and livelihoods. So mining and logging and farming restrictions hurts communities that really survive off of it. And a lot of the world that we live in today do depend on like these rural communities and like farming. For example, like the Tanzanian Serengeti grazing restrictions had a lot of impact on the local communities. And I think it's the most immediate impact and it's very, very intuitive. Like if you're not able to farm, then you're not able to uphold your family. And it's not just a family, right? It's like the local communities, the rural population living in those areas. And it guarantees an opposition, a pretty clean ballot on the local communities. But it's also important to weigh on, firstly, the immediacy and how they're the most vulnerable. And I'll get into why, how we can weigh the most vulnerable in a second. The second argument to run on the opposition is going to be practicality and governance. So we already look at like we have to, in order for the proposition to implement and be able to access their benefits, they need to be able to guarantee that these protections are firstly good and second that they're going to happen very fast. But I think even if the proposition guarantees a fiat, oh, we're going to be able to implement these protections, they don't guarantee that they're going to be helpful to the communities in which they're supporting. Especially, I think there's like we can have like a layered even if reasoning. So like firstly, global coordination is very, very difficult. We look at a lot of UN environmental treaties unenforced, right? And if we're looking at the government being the actor that is going to enforce these protections, then we think it's not going to be, it's going to be much harder insofar as like there isn't going to be a lot of enforcement. But then also it makes them look unrealistic, the proposition look unrealistic, and you can frame it as like idealism versus realism. And the proposition would have to win this prerequisite in order to access their offense. I think you can really frame it as like, firstly, a lot of governments don't even believe that climate change is real. So how are you going to convince them that protecting indigenous communities and protecting ecological systems are utmost importance? I think that would be best by the community. And then also secondly, like even if they do believe it, it's going to be really, really hard to enforce because you're not going to get enforcement all across the world. But if the only way you're going to be able to get it all across the world is through like the UN and environmental treaties, then we already look at like those not being unenforced. So I think if they were to pick, they're really in a double bind. So either world that they pick isn't really going to like impact out to being like all the impacts that they want to come to fruition for the prop. And then the third argument is on equity and access rights. So firstly, a lot of the restrictions harm the most vulnerable communities, and this is a little bit different than the first argument because it talks about the displacement of these communities more than like the economic impact and their livelihood. This is a really, really good argument because it firstly frames the proposition as elitist, and then it counters their indigenous and cultural argument with unique positive material because a lot of like indigenous groups, yes, you're protecting it for them, but if you're not going to protect these indigenous lands for the local communities to be able to use them, then what is the point of protecting them? Especially if you're going to displace these local communities, even if these land is being protected. And it gives the opposition a really, really high moral ground as well, because you can frame this like frame this argument as environmental colonialism and like how they've like governments and like big nations have used this as like a way to be able to colonize the environment. We think colonizing the environment is very, very unique insofar as like that's one thing that you need to be able to have in order to live. And then secondly is that roles in justice asserts that like the most important stakeholders are the most vulnerable. And in this case, the most vulnerable are these local communities that are very, very dependent on this land and have a cultural tie. So if they're the most vulnerable, then essentially we should be prioritizing them as the local stakeholders. So so the central clashes in the wing. So for the clashes, we have first on short term versus long term. The proposition obviously is going to be fighting for the long term, believing that is very, very important for sustainability. The opposition is going to be fighting for, oh, the short term is going to be the prerequisite to being able to access any long term benefits. And then the clash of the economic versus environmental impact, the proposition is going to be like, hey, the economy cannot exist without the environment. And then the opposition is going to be like, well, the people who need to be able to live in the environment need to be able to exist through economic financial means, and you're going to be displacing them. You're going to be displacing them whenever you displace them out of these communities whenever you force them out, whenever you're protecting these lands. And then the third clash is about like local versus global. So the proposition is going to be like they have global because it's more scope, but then the opposition could always be like it's firstly it's the local they win on magnitude, and secondly because of the Rawlsian principle. Like if you were to help anyone on this planet, not knowing who you were, you would help the most vulnerable and the most marginalized because they've been harmed the most. So then for some weighing, the proposition for justice, propositions like they protect future generations. The opposition is like we shouldn't sacrifice the current generations. And you can always use like the little bit of rhetoric, like even if future generations didn't consent to being born into this world, neither did current generations. Secondly, on like practicality, on like the proposition, you'd be like, hey, no, this is going to be enforceable and with funding. The opposition can always talk about how laws are going to fail without local buy-in and how that is going to be the prerequisite to being able to access any practical benefits. And then time frame for the proposition is going to be the long-term irreversible loss, and the opposition is going to be the immediate short-term irreversible human cost. So even if, for example, like um, the opposition wins on the time frame and the practicality argument, if like proposition can access a little bit of the fiat power and win justice of like hey we protect future generations, then weighing these different weighing mechanisms against each other is also very important to determine the judge's ballot. So the proposition path to ballot is essentially going to be about urgency and irreversibility. Biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse are one-way doors. So like once coral reefs are bleached or old growth forests or logged, they cannot be replaced in human timescales. So if protection now prevents irreversible global harm later. So then we look at like the Great Barrier Reef. It lost half of its corals over since like 1995. And since restoration costs are like extreme, local protections have like slowed further loss. But if we were to look at the opposition side, we'd probably be in a much worse state. The also can another path to ballot for the proposition is on the long-term socioeconomic benefits. So, framing the environment as being inseparable from people's survival. So, like protection means protecting drinking water, flood safety, and food security. So, if we look at like the World Bank, it looks like mangroves prevent $65 billion in annual flood damage globally. So, you can also win a bit on the economic benefits that the opposition is going to push. For other arguments that the proposition could run to take like a different lens at like this debate, they could run things about public health and about how the forests reduce air pollution. Secondly, they could run things about food security, about how fisheries are going to collapse without preserves. Food security is obviously very important because we can't exist without having good food, and a lot of marginalized people are also going to die if we don't protect these fisheries and different land preserves. And then the third thing is like disaster protection, which like mangroves lower the hurricane damage, and that's also very important, especially for like the marginalized communities that the opposition is really going to harp on. The opposition paths the ballot. I think there's three. I think firstly, it's very important to humanize like the families that are going to be losing their ancestral grazing land or fisher arrested for like entering new marine reserves that they really depend on. Like we look at Kenya's evictions from the Mau Forest Reserve led to like massive livelihood loss and backlash against conservation efforts. Like why should these individuals have to walk away from their land or be forced out of the land whenever and forced into poverty whenever they deserve to work on that land if that is their means to being able to access an economic livelihood. Second thing is portraying the prop as a very unrealistic and very idealistic society. Like over 60% of the marine protected areas globally lack active management or enforcement. I think you really have to go into the weeds. Who is going to be paying for these new rangers? Who is going to be enforcing these regulations? How are you going to stop illegal logging whenever enforcement budgets are already very stretched for things? I think, yes, maybe the proposition can get a minimal impact, but I think the opposition has to be very good at conveying how big of an impact that is and how their impacts actually outweigh that. And then the third thing is on colonial environmentalism. I think protection without having the community's say in it is essentially oppression, is essentially colonialism. And we think our side of the house has a world in which these local communities are involved in that. So we can show how conservation efforts, quote, mirror colonial land grabs. They erase indigenous stewardship and local livelihoods, like the eviction of the Maasai in Tanzania or the Botwa in Uganda under fortress conservation models. Really just erase like the indigenous stewardship that was really bad, and I think that gives you ground on the moral and ethical lens that the proposition also has offense on. Then I think other arguments that the opposition could run is like firstly on like the conservation black markets, like poaching will actually increase under these very, very strict bans. And then secondly, it's going to be like the foreign NGOs that are going to be profiting on these protections rather than like the locals. And we think if they already have so much money, why are we giving them more power and why are we letting them profit? And then also thirdly, I think we need to talk about how people are a part of nature and making sure that sustainable development with humans is going to be the most important, the most helpful, not separate from it. So that was the end of my slideshow. I will stop sharing so Kate can share.
All right, wonderful. Let me share my screen. Hold on. Oh, sorry, guys. It's taking just a second, I swear. Um, okay, Zoom is weird. I apologize. Let me try sharing my screen again. Okay. I'm hoping you can see my screen right now.
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, perfect. So today's motion is this House, as the European Union, would ban member nations from importing Russian natural gas. So just a few things to keep in note in today's presentation. This is a World Schools motion analysis for the EU having a Russian gas ban, meaning that this is a actor's motion indicating that we look out for the best interest of the European Union and all the countries involved, and how to ban relations and importing of Russian natural gas. But a few things in the slideshow. Firstly, going over the context of why this ban is necessary, and then looking at the proposition and opposition strategy for this round. So firstly, on what you need to know. What exactly is the EU? The EU is made up of 27 European countries that are joined together to make joint decisions on things such as trade, politics, and safety. Some of the biggest countries involved with the EU are the UK. Russia was previously involved, but now they're not. But the biggest way that you can think of the EU is it's kind of a club to where a ton of European nations come together and they look out for each other and how they can put European politics forward on the global stage. So it's kind of like having NATO for like the US and other Western countries. However, this is specifically for Europe. But then what is natural gas? It is an energy source that heats homes, it powers factories, and it makes electricity. This means that it is a very essential necessity to have within Europe. And here's the problem. Russia has cheap gas and has decided to sell it to the EU for decades. So if the EU has had a reliance on Russia for having cheap gas, it's probably going to be hard to ban it in the first place. But how exactly did the problem arise, and why is the EU suddenly trying to ban it? Well, in 2022, this is when the problem really happened. It's when Russia invaded Ukraine. When EU tried to punish Russia with sanctions, Russia basically said, okay, no more gas for you. And they cut off Poland, they cut off Bulgaria. And it was kind of like, if you support Ukraine, you'll cut their energy. So the main reason why a ban is taking place right now is to have solidarity against Russia and against their actions towards Ukraine. However, the biggest issue of pulling out of this deal and stopping imports is the fact that EU countries do have a reliance on Russia. But what is happening today? Because sure, this has been happening since 2022, but what exactly is the EU doing today? Well, the EU dropped Russian gas from 40% of supply in 2021 down to 15% in 2024. So this is a drastic drop, showing that, hey, they're moving aside from it to show solidarity in favor of Ukraine. So what should the debate exactly be about before we get into both sides? Well, the debate is specifically about if the EU should like completely ban it or if they should keep some of the trade happening. So, what are some of the key definitions in each side's arguments that you need to know in the round? Firstly, what does ban mean? This can go for both sides, but for the proposition, it looks like a complete stop. No Russian gas allowed, and it's not reducing it, it's not making it more expensive, it's completely cutting off relations as a whole. And this means that all 27 EU countries have to follow that rule, not just some, but all of them. So, what exactly does the proposition say? Remember, this is an actor's motion, meaning that we are looking out for the best interest and decisions of the EU. So the proposition is in favor of having this ban in the first place. So what exactly does the proposition say in framework? They say that a complete ban is right for a few reasons. They're probably going to look like, one, Russia uses gas as a weapon against us, so we obviously can't trust them. Two, it's hypocritical to say we oppose Russia while paying them billions for gas. And then three, forcing the switch to clean energy will make Europe richer and stronger for the long term. So just by having the definition of ban, you get three grounds on your side. Firstly, you say, hey, we kind of don't want to support Russia anymore because they're invading Ukraine, and they've continuously done this for years. But then secondly, it's hypocritical to say, hey, we're still going to pay for our interests of our citizens, even though we are actively funding a war. And then thirdly, it's more strategic for the EU to switch to clean energy to make not only their countries stronger for the short term, but also for the long term. So then, what does the opposition say for like going against the ban? Well, they say the ban is probably wrong for about three reasons. Firstly, we can't actually do it because LNG, liquid natural gas terminals, take years to build. Secondly, it will destroy factories and jobs in Europe, meaning millions of people will lose their work. And then thirdly, the EU shouldn't force all 27 countries to do the same thing when each country is in different situations. Again, the opposition gets three different grounds on their side of the house. Firstly, it's kind of saying that, hey, this ban is infeasible to do. Stopping all imports at one time is going to put a ton of countries into different stability modes. Why is that? Because each country is equipped for different scenarios. For example, one country probably uses more liquid natural gas than another. So it's not fair to say that all 27 should immediately implement this plan. But then, what is the real question out of today's debate that both sides of the House are going to have to deal with? Firstly, is the EU strong enough to actually cut off Russian energy and survive? Because this is a big argument that will be made. You've had decades of dependence on Russia. How are you suddenly going to switch at like last minute? But then secondly, will it actually hurt European workers too much, or will work stay the same? So who exactly cares about this debate? This is more of the later half of framework to where you'll include stakeholders, the burdens, and maybe even a stance. So firstly, on stakeholders, who exactly are the people impacted by a ban that the European Union would make? Firstly, factory workers. In chemical plants, steel mills, car factories, these places need cheap energy. If gas gets expensive, factories close and people will lose their jobs. But then secondly, are the Ukrainian people. They need the EU to stay strong and help them against Russia. Thirdly, are EU governments. They have to manage the economy and keep citizens happy. But then last stakeholder involved is the EU's global power. If Europe falls apart, it's weaker on the world stage. So just alone, you have four different choices to choose of people to like defend whenever you're doing weighing or writing out impacts. This could look like protecting people in the job market on either side of the house, or even protecting the EU on a global stage with how it interacts with other countries such as like China or the US. But then what does the proposition have to prove? This is kind of a burden that the proposition will take. They have to prove that a complete ban is the best choice because it makes Europe stronger, more independent, and more honest about its values. And they also have to prove that the benefits outweigh the cost. This is most important, especially in later round speeches, whenever you're weighing out to the judge how to vote, because your arguments were able to prove this from the start. But then for the opposition, they must prove that a complete ban is not the best choice because it's actually impossible to do. It will hurt workers, and Europe should respect each country's own energy choices because they all are in different scenarios. But then they also have to show why doing nothing or doing less is smarter. Again, same thing with the proposition. These burdens are very strategic to have in the later half of the round, so you can weigh out to the judge, hey, we were able to fulfill our burden either through refutation or through your arguments. But then lastly, what is the real question for today's debate? It's which side better protects European workers and or keeps Europe strong. With that being said, let's look at the proposition side of the house. For substantive, this is kind of an idea of where you could go. Russia uses energy as a weapon and we can't trust them. This argument is basically saying, hey, we shouldn't be funding a war that is actively happening against a fellow European nation. So the main argument that you can really use to make it friendly for all judges, whether it's a parent judge or a very seasoned judge at a national circuit tournament. The main point of the argument is to express the fact that Russia weaponizes gas, but they also use the money spent from imports on weapons. When the EU supported Ukraine, Russia cut the gas completely. That is a fact that the opposition can't deny at all. This also proves that Russia uses energy to blackmail Europe, meaning we literally can't trust them even if we were to keep imports still going through. But then, if the EU stays dependent on Russian gas, Russia will always have power over the EU, meaning that a ban would mean that the EU is free from any threat of having energy insecurity, but also having a threat of possibly an invasion on one of their countries. A few of the examples that you can use for this kind of substantive is an example, firstly, from September of 2022, when Russia shut down the Nord Stream 1 pipeline and Europe suddenly panicked about having no gas. Secondly is Poland in 2022, when they wouldn't support Ukraine enough, so Russia cut their gas off completely, and Poland suffered but didn't give in. And then a third example you could possibly use was Bulgaria in 2022. Same thing, they refused Russia's demands, they lost gas, and all three of these see how natural oil and natural liquid gas is seen as a punishment for Russia. It's something that they can hold over countries to get what they want. So why exactly does this matter? If Europe stays dependent on Russia, Russia can blackmail any European nation forever. And that's really bad on the global stage. Why? Because if you're looking at this from an actor's debate, a perspective of the European nation or union, it looks really bad to have one very aggressive country hold a ton of power over you when you're making decisions politically, economically, or just looking out for the best interest of your citizens. So if we were to do this, then we would have to worry about, hey, when will be the next time Russia might cut our gas? And that's bad because then you're stuck in a permanent cycle of not being able to support Ukraine or help refugees or actually hold Russia accountable. So what is the biggest impact from the substantive? It's the fact that Europe truly becomes independent whenever you in place a ban. We can help Ukraine without fear, and NATO gets stronger, and Russia can't divide us anymore. These impacts are very important because, one, it looks out for the long-term interests of the EU and their countries involved. This looks like relations with NATO, but also being able to hold them accountable on the global stage and not living in fear of having any instability. The second argument that proposition can possibly make is saying that they oppose Russia, however, we give them billions. Basically, the idea of this argument is saying that, hey, you are actively funding a war even though you go off the principles of wanting peace and prosperity within Europe. For example, the main point of this argument is that Europe says, hey, we don't support Russia, put sanctions on them, but then continues to buy gas from them. This means that the money goes directly into Russia's government budget, which then funds the military for weapons and tanks and more aggressive tools to use against Ukraine. So it's very counterintuitive for them to provide money and then also go against their own beliefs. So here's a very shocking example that you could really use to pull a judge's attention in, but also it's a fact that the opposition can't deny. Before 2022, Europe paid Russia $300 billion a year for gas. That's enough money for weapons, to pay soldiers, to build tanks, and to progress Russia's aggression towards Ukraine. Europe was literally funding the invasion of Ukraine while they were staying opposed to it, and that's entirely hypocritical, meaning the only way that you can stop the hypocrisy is by imposing a ban. So then, why does this matter for proposition and for the arguments? You can't just say that you oppose a war and then continue to fund it. It's completely dishonest. So then, if you're looking completely dishonest on the global stage, you one, lose credibility with other like global leaders like the United States or other organizations like the UN or NATO. But then two, you also hurt your country in the long term with citizens and government trust. So then, what is the largest impact from this argument? Europe basically becomes believable. When they threaten sanctions on other bad actors such as China, Iran, etc., they will actually listen because they know that they mean it for sure this time. The EU's power comes strictly from honesty, meaning the only way that the EU can actually move forward and not be hypocritical of their own principles is by acting with their words. The third argument that you could possibly run, it might not be a favorable argument for all judges, but judges do like to see creative third substantives. And this is probably one of the best arguments you can make on this motion that's a little out there, but it's very attention grabbing. It's basically a climate change argument saying that you're able to go green and it's better for the economic prosperity, but also the long term for EU nations. So, what is the basis of this argument? The world is moving to a renewable energy anyways, so that means gas is old technology. Meaning that if you continue to fund Russia, you're inevitably like stifling yourself from being able to innovate further, and it's better to look into new like innovations. So, for example, a ban would force Europe to switch to wind and solar instead of having to wait to phase out like the money that's being spent on this oil. For example, Europe could then become the world leader in clean energy. This would lead to more jobs, money, and more power, especially on the global stage, with being one of the first government organizations, but also global organizations to take this stance. So what are some of the facts that you can use underneath the substantive? Firstly, you could say that solar panels cost dropped 80% over the last 10 years. Secondly, wind power is now cheaper than coal. Thirdly, Poland banned Russian gas and now actually has 50% renewable electricity, and they didn't collapse, they actually thrived. This is a good example to use, especially if the opposition is going to say, hey, these sources are really unreliable and you actually can't switch to them automatically. Well, you can then preempt that and say, hey, that's not true. Poland actually did this with a Russian scenario and we're actually successful with it. But a few more examples you could use are Germany building massive wind farms and even Denmark getting 80% of their power from the wind. So why exactly does this argument matter? If Europe switches to solar or wind first, Europe companies can get rich selling that technology worldwide. Then the US and China are also building solar. But whoever leads gets the market, meaning that Europe would be the clean tech superpower, which means you innovate for the long term economically for Europe, but you also show more innovation out of the organization. This is really impactful because one, you get millions of new green jobs. Secondly, Europe becomes really rich and independent, but alongside becoming wealthier and independent, you also save the climate alongside it. So on every win, it's really good for this side. But what about the opposition, the side that doesn't actually want to impose a ban? The first substantive that the opposition could run is that you can't build alternatives to gas within enough time. Why is this important? Because remember the dependency that the EU does have on Russia. They've had a dependency for decades on liquid natural gas and other things that they import. So the premise of this argument is the fact that, hey, you can't just snap your fingers and create alternatives to Russian gas. And for example, building LNG terminals, which are ships that bring liquefied gas over, takes about 5 to 7 years, and each one costs about 5 to 7 billion pounds. This is too much money and it's too much time. A ban literally would not work for opposition because the infrastructure does not exist yet, meaning you're pouring more money into an issue, but also having to solve problems that you wouldn't have if you just didn't ban in the first place. So, what are the real problems and some of the examples that you could use to support this argument? Firstly, countries like Hungary are literally landlocked and they have no LNG terminal. They can't access liquefied gas from ships and they're surrounded by land. Global LNG capacity is already full and every LNG producer is already selling their gas. If Europe tries to buy 40% more gas, there's nowhere for it to come from. So you can really run a timeline argument here, saying what is the comparative of having a ban? This is where you do some preemption work of the proposition. So the proposition might say, hey, we're going to ban this now with XYZ model. But here's the thing. Hungary still needs gas in 2025, 2026, and 2027. Meaning, if you were to impose a ban, where would they get gas or even energy over these 3 years? Because it takes about 5 to 7 years to even build this kind of infrastructure in the first place. Meaning, it's literally impossible for them to get gas. If this happens, Europe will cut off Russian gas, but then have no replacements, no factories, and then people will freeze. Hospitals will shut down, essential services will go down. You can really drag the impact out very further here, saying that the impacts of a ban look like the suffrage of individuals, especially during colder months to where you need the heat and electricity, but also to operate efficiently with things like hospitals. The impact that you can use here on this argument is the fact that a ban is impossible to actually do. It fails in practice, and then Europe loses credibility when it can't even enforce its own rules. That looks really bad for the EU, especially on a global stage, saying, well, you impose a certain ban, but you can't even follow it up. It's kind of like the hypocrisy argument from proposition, except in a different context. The second substantive then that the opposition could run is how gas is expensive, factories will close, and people will lose their jobs. This is basically an economic argument saying that the switch, especially away from imports, is impossible and it will hurt economies in the long term. So the basic argument you can make here is the fact that gas from other sources like LNG is 2 to 3 times more expensive than Russian pipeline gas. If Europe switches, energy costs skyrocket. Chemical factories, steel mills, car plants, they can't survive paying 2 to 3 times more for the same energy that they were able to afford pre-ban. They'll have to close down or even move to alternatives like America or Asia where energy is cheaper. This is really bad because then that means you're technically offshoring and moving away from your own local economy, which means, one, you're paying more for the same product that you could have produced, but then two, you're taking away from your own economy that you could have built up. One of the biggest examples that you could use here is the BASF, which is Germany's biggest chemical company. They're already warning that they might leave Europe if gas prices stay high. And this is bad because this company employs 110,000 people. If this company leaves Germany, then what happens to these workers? The same thing that happened to steel mills in Poland factories in Slovakia, and millions of people will literally lose their jobs. So this is a massive economic impact that you can make here alone. But then what is the ripple effect? This is kind of showing like the long-term effect of a ban. Firstly, factory workers will lose their jobs. People can't pay rent. When people can't pay rent, they have to move away. Their kids will lose school, and a community will collapse entirely. And sure, this does sound dramatic. However, this is a reality that will actually happen. And here's the worst part. The proposition says that it's worth it for people to go through this entire economic suffrage. They think it's okay for people to lose their jobs, lose their livelihoods, and not be able to afford their own quality of life or sustain themselves. So what is the biggest impact that you can get here? A few things. Firstly, mass unemployment, which will always be bad because of an individual level, but also on a national level with economics. Secondly, economic depression. Thirdly, angry voters asking why exactly did we impose a ban on this? Fourthly, far-right politics will rise, meaning that people will look for an alternative so that way they can get away from blaming the situation. Fifthly, EU governments will collapse. And then lastly, Europe will become weaker, not stronger. And this is so bad, especially for the long term. But then what is the last argument that opposition can make? It's the fact that all EU countries are different and one rule doesn't fit all. This is kind of the argument saying that, hey, you have to evaluate every person's situation differently. It's not fair to impose the same ban on all 27 nations. So with that being said, for example, Poland is really strong. They already kicked out Russian gas. Hungary is also within the EU. They can't do the same thing. They're landlocked. They're surrounded by mountains. They have absolutely no alternatives. Whereas Germany, which is also underneath this, has industry. Cyprus is mostly just tourism. This shows the fact that every country has a different situation, meaning that you can't force one rule onto everybody. Some examples that you could use here. Firstly, for Poland in 2022, they decided to ban Russian gas themselves. They built an LNG terminal. They invested in alternatives. Sure, that was very successful for them. However, it's a different story for Hungary in 2022. They tried to negotiate different terms with Russia. Different situation, different choices. Europe should let countries choose what works for them and not force a one-size-fits-all approach, because each country has a different economic levels. They have different pull factors. They have different climates. The situation is so different for every single country. But then why exactly does this matter for the round? The EU is supposed to let member countries make their own decisions about energy because that's called subsidiarity, because big decisions made at local levels, even when impossible, are really hard to do. But then forcing countries like Hungary to do something physically impossible violates that principle that they operate off of. It can also make smaller countries angry, and it can breed distrust within the organization, which is really bad because then you'll have issues within the EU, and then that impacts their ability to make future decisions, whether that's political, economic, or even just sustaining the organization as a whole. But then lastly, what is the impact you can use here? If EU ignores member countries and forces bad policies anyways, countries will lose faith, the EU might break apart, and then that means each country is going to lose out on different values, especially with having membership. So that is all I have for Russian natural gas and oil.
Beautiful. Thank you both so much for um giving a lecture. We really appreciate it. If anyone has any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. But um, yeah, if not, you can, if they come up later, you can Slack me on the Win Slack or DM the Win Instagram, email anyone, anything works to ask questions. But yeah, if we don't have any questions, yeah, I think we're good. Thank you so much.